Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to Quartet. It's nice to have you with us. It's a sunshiny day here in West Virginia, and we're happy to have you with us along with our trio today with Frank Jacob. Hi, Frank. How are you, my friend?
How you doing, John? Good to be here. How are things in Berkeley Springs?
Sunshiny. It's a perfect day, except they cut our power, and so we're running off and generators. Like Gregg Braden, I understand. Hi, Greg.
Hey, it's good to see everyone, Frank, John. We have power, but they cut our communications lines, so we all get to test our backup systems today.
Well, it's a good thing to do every once in a while, I
Yeah.
guess. We find out all kinds of little problems. But in any case, welcome, and it's nice to have you all with us. We're going to have a very interesting conversation here about what the value of statehood is, and is the United States the next country to break up into smaller pieces? And so, hang around; you'll enjoy this, I'm sure. But let's start as we always do by running around in a circle and saying what you've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks. Let's start with you, Frank. What's been on your mind?
Well, last week before I was preparing to do for a workshop that I did in Munich, Germany last weekend, full day. So these full day workshops always require a bit of preparation, which, the long days. And it was great, and I realized again doing the workshop that I was reminded of the difference between just, virtual appearances such as this, which is great for getting to a international audience instantaneously, and face-to-face encounters with people actually sitting in the same room with you, right?
Well,
So it's just you really sense there's a kind of an energy that you can, it's palpable, and I'm sure you know all about that as well, Greg. And it was great to do that. And then, the after dinner celebration, and whatnot. And then of course losing my voice because I I talked too many hours. And but I think what I've been noticing over here, I've been observing with some on another note, apprehension is what's going on with this new German government, this Chancellor Merz, he's come into power, and we all caught a little bit of the Zelensky Trump slapdown. And so what happens is he comes over here, and now we have this new chancellor literally removing limits on defense spending and miraculously pulling out like 500 billion euros in a special fund for German military infrastructure. So you're going like, where is this going? It's amazing how like there's never any money for stuff that would help civilization organize better, get them all ham radios, get things in case everything crashes. No, but there's always 500 billion for this defense fund. And then on the dime, as if it was on cue, and of course it probably was, Ursula von der Leyen and the EU suddenly miraculously popped up with 800 billion to add to the slush fund, right? All of it indicating that, they want to escalate and move into a war mentality, at least an infrastructure. I mean, why would you need an infrastructure if you haven't had one all these years? And so, it's interesting. You've got the Trump angle, you've got the European angle, and watching that, it's a little bit worrisome, I got to say, sitting very close to it over here. I could literally drive to the war zone from where I'm living right now.
Yeah, if it gets boring in the afternoon or something. Well, great. What have you been thinking about?
I had myself muted there. Frank, you and I are watching a lot of the same things. So I'm going to back up about half a step. We ended our last program with predictions. We said, what did we think would happen the next 2 weeks? One of the things that I was watching 2 weeks ago was I said I thought the ceasefire in the Middle East would end, and it effectively has. Formally, it has not, but it effectively has. And I think we're watching the destabilization of the power structures, and especially what's going on in Syria right now. So I just wanted to comment on that. I have really had my eye on the unprecedented movement of gold into the United States from all over the world. Huge shipments, just huge cargo planes from London were coming in last week. And apparently this is gold. It is American gold that has been in other countries, and they're bringing it back. And there is a lot of evidence suggesting we'll probably see some kind of a monetary reset here pretty quickly. And I think this is fascinating. The gold on the balance sheets of the United States is still pegged at a little over $42 an ounce, where the spot price is hovering around 3,000 an ounce, and that's manipulated. They will probably reset. If they do a reset, gold should be around at least 5,000 an ounce, possibly more. And if they're able to do that, which it looks like we're in the process of doing, as we did in 1933, this is what was happening in 33, all of a sudden the U.S. debt uh, becomes very, interestingly, the amount of gold that we have at the market prices will pretty much offset the debt on that balance sheet. And the U.S. economy and the world economy is going to take on a whole new trajectory. So I'm watching that. That's been on my mind this last week. And they're downplaying this, John, but the euthanization of hundreds of millions of poultry needlessly, the excuse that's being given is because of the bird flu. What they're not talking about a lot is that not just the poultry, but the livestock and even insects like the bees are all being replaced with bees that have. I want us to be able to use this on YouTube, so I'll be careful of language, but I'll say they have been inoculated with a gene therapy platform. And the research suggests that that may be transferable through the food chain into the human body. So I'm watching that very, very closely as well. So those were pretty much, and the militarization of Europe and moving toward a war footing. I think I'm going to speak less about that now because I think that is going to be part of the conversation that we're going to have about statehood today.
Yeah, good, good. Thank you much. I've been kind of impressed by a couple of things, and one of them is the kind of alert that Cliff Hyde put out, suggesting that there's at least 100 times and maybe as much as 1,000 times more more dollars in play than are on the books. Essentially, is that there's this huge amount that, which would explain perhaps a lot of the black budgets and the other kind of things that, and the missing money in the Department of Defense and HUD and so on. But if it comes out, and apparently the Doge people, the Trump Doge people, are knocking on the door, and if it starts to come out, it has the potential of generating rapid kind of failure, collapse of the dollar. And when you think about that in terms of something like that might maybe happening in the next month or so, and then consider the fact that there are multiple sources that are now, including Penny and others, that are saying that there's something big that's going to happen in April. Then you're kind of on the edge of saying that there's something really big kind of forming down there. And by the way, we missed saying that our friend Penny Kelly is not with us today. She's out on the road, and we're missing Penny Kelly, but we're going to soldier on nevertheless. And so, anyway, that's thank you for that, and we'll come back and talk about some of those things a little bit later. And certainly, if they all happen, we'll be talking about them much later for a long period of time. It's time for our topic of the day, and it's an interesting topic proposed originally by Penny Kelly, who sadly, again, is not with us. But it's really about the kind of the role of statehood. And it starts by saying that, we have a history here, a recent history of the breakup of major states and nations. The USSR, of course, came apart in the 90s. And then by the late 90s, Yugoslavia had broken up into a number of smaller countries: Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Herzegovina, Slovenia, and Macedonia. I never would be able to remember all of those if I didn't have it written down. And so her question is, what spots what sweet spots and advantages does statehood offer? I mean, her previous question is the United States going to be the next country that breaks up? And to that comment, I mean, maybe that's a derivative. She certainly heard it on here, but Martin Armstrong argues that his computer, which has never been wrong for 40 years, predicts that between, somewhere in the next like 2 years, it starts to come apart. The United States starts to come apart. And certainly by 2032, that there are maybe 5 other countries in the North America. Well, that's one kind of model. That's one kind of solution to a breakup. By the way, he also predicts the similar kind of things happening in Europe, which Frank has just alluded to in terms of what's going on these days over there. But so the question is the United States going to be next online? And then, are there intrinsic benefits to statehood? And we can talk about that. And then where are the shortcomings? Because what you're looking at potentially out of the back end of this thing, if you consider the fact that we're on a track toward an emergent new world, then that emergent new world may not look the same. It, by definition, won't look the same as the way this one does. And that means that governments won't necessarily at all operate the same way they do now. May not even have governments. I don't know how that might happen, but there are a lot of kind of open questions here. So let's start with you, Gregg. What do you think about all this?
John, I've thought about this a lot, and I think about it in terms of near term and long term. I think we will see a time where the idea of countries and borders takes on a very new meaning, but that can only happen when you have parity between the different cultures and between the different economies. As long as you have disparity, then there are going to be those borders. So we're not there yet. You asked essentially, I read 4 questions, so I'm going to address each of those. Is U.S. Next in the breakup? I think the race is on. Europe is driving the movement to break up large power structures. And Europe is driving, the EU is driving the ideas that would lead to the breakup of America. But they are, I think, closer to breaking up Russia. Europe is looking at Russia as a resource. And Frank, I think what you're seeing is the foundation of a longer term process. They want to break up Russia into even smaller countries than were created at the end of the Cold War and divvy up those resources so that Europe once again can become the superpower that it's been in the past. And so they're now on a military footing. I think that if America experiences a breakup, I think we are less vulnerable to the pressures, the external pressures of Europe, the European Union right now. I think our greatest threat, as we've heard from the past, comes from within. So I would not be surprised to see Russia fall before America falls. And I think if there was a time when Martin Armstrong's Socrates timeline, I think, was probably more viable. I think it's less viable within 24 months is what we're talking about, that America is going to be broken up. I'm not saying it won't happen. I think we'll probably see it to happen with Russia first. So that was the first question: is the next breakup of America and the U.S. If it happens, though, what are the advantages of statehood? Whereas if the state is an individual state, and many of the countries in Europe are actually smaller than some American states, so they don't have to have individual states, within their countries. When I think of this, John, I think less of America actually dividing into separate countries and more of America perhaps retaining the union of the 50 states for the advantages that I just shared, but dividing into provinces, kind of like Canada has, where we have progressive or liberal provinces, conservative provinces, where people can move and live the way they, the values that they want. They still have those, but they also have the benefit of the economic and the financial union of being part of the United States. I wouldn't be surprised to see that because the paperwork has already been drawn up and it's already been, they've already had those proposals. They were tabled, but the ideas are being floated out there more for a division in terms of provinces. Now, ultimately, those provinces could lead to a further breakup in the states. But I'm not saying it won't happen, and I'm not saying I don't agree with the things that Martin Armstrong says, but I think the computer models are based upon principles that are changing so quickly that model will have to take those into account. I think my conclusion was that a smaller country doesn't need states. The only time we would need the states is if we retain a large country but want some kind of individual sovereignty uh, to reflect the values of the community in those states. So, yeah.
Very nice, Greg. I totally agree actually with you. The question about whether the United States will break up or be the next breakup, I don't think so. But I do think it'll depend on whether there will be kind of a palpable divide between those people who are pushing an AI-centric society and a kind of a transhumanist agenda versus those who kind of want to hold on and maintain traditional norms like the organic humanity, and whether that will lead to a civil war of some kind. Um, I personally don't, I think that the point of no return is approaching where kind of the pendulum swing between left and right may actually stop because technology is going to become so all powerful that guns and posses and tiny prepper communities, they're not going to have a chance against this kind of technology. It'll just be taken out with micro drones or something, right? But I doubt the USA will break up because currently Americans, they have way more in common than they don't have in common. And their trading zone, let's not forget, it's the largest by far on the planet. And all the people there are using the same currency. Those are things that are of huge blockages, which are already moved out of the way. I think I read somewhere that America has 47 trillion and as far as a economy goes, compared to the next largest one, which is China, which I think was only at 11, compared to Russia, something like 1.5, right? So that's kind of some scales. But we can't rule out these turbulences that are being brought on by the new Trump super Doge team, moving us toward technocracy and getting some kind of a blowback. But it's kind of sad to say this, but I think most people are in terrible physical shape in America. They're overweight, obese, half the population, okay, by some estimates, is currently under the influence of mind-altering antidepressant drugs. So not exactly fit for a revolution, I would say. So, but jumping to the example that you brought out, John, about, these countries, you were leaving out Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia as those little countries, right? And let's not also forget the history lesson. Like the reason Yugoslavia broke up had to do with the fact that the First World War, after it was over, many of those lands were arbitrarily carved up by the victors based, with no regard to ethnicities. And they mixed together people that had no, that didn't have anything in common, and it led to a lot of problems. And the other reason that those countries lost their sovereign status had to do with communism, which during the Second World War pushed all the way to the border of Germany and swallowed pretty much every single nation in its path. So those nations have always resented the communist regime. In Serbia alone, for example, I was doing some reading about how, after the Second World War broke out, um, literally these after the war ended, these communist regimes came in and ethnically cleansed 100,000 by some estimates of Germans, Serbs, Hungarians. I mean, these were not nice people. So obviously, when the Soviet regime began to crumble, these states were extremely eager to take back their sovereignty, and they definitely tried. The problems that they had, in my opinion, and from what you could see, is that they tried, but they had things like massive corruption and they had a lack of know-how. And I think in order for a small state to succeed in building something like nationhood, once it breaks free from a monster state, there has to be a unified vision. There has to be some form of organized leadership which works strictly on behalf of the people for the right reasons. Again, we brought in that topic of honesty and integrity, right? This is part of that. So it depends on the people and on whether there even is competent leadership and whether there's accountability for those states to even succeed. And so there's another angle also to this whole thing, which is an anthropological angle. And I think the term here is ethnogenesis. And this is sort of the original reason why there were even something like nation states, because there was these social groups began to emerge as society grew in numbers and identified according to a certain identity, like usually an ethnic identity, or most often it was a language thing. And I think that's really an interesting topic because I was reading on ethnogenesis, and there's different types of it. There's like a passive version, which is when the human species aggregates according to their cultural, geographical, lingual, and whatever strategical grounded constructs to form something of a nationhood. In that sense, it's really just the neighborhood expanding to the county, expanding to the state, and eventually outward to the point where there's a natural boundary, like an ocean or a mountain, right? So if the United States were to break up, for example, I think it would probably break up along those kinds of geographic boundaries because you have so many of them over there. You got oceans, you got mountains, you got huge, huge rivers, right? So that would be kind of a natural form of a passive ethnogenesis. But the nice thing I like about that, that concept, and I don't know how realistic it is anymore in our world, in our modern world now, but it's it's based on a variety of cultural identities. And I think when people can learn to live in peace with each other and they're respecting this diversity, that's a beautiful and a colorful form of existence. But I don't know how realistic it is. The other form of ethnogenesis that I was reading up on is active, and that's when there's a deliberate planning and a deliberate engineering along something like a political ideology. Like you had that in Germany after they decimated, and had a major land grab and bankrupted the country after they piled huge war reparations on them after World War One. They ended up electing a leader who pledged to build their nation up along a concept, and that concept was the farmer, right? And the farmers were put in the forefront, and the farmers provided the productivity upon which the rest of the nation could be built. And then they attempted to piece together their lost lands, and they took back control of their currency, threw out central bankers, and set up free trade zones with other countries all around the world. And guess what, man? It worked, right? It blossomed in 12 years. It was shocking for people how quickly they come up. So it is possible and it can work. But whenever I bring this topic up with people, they'll tell me, well, that was back then. That doesn't really work nowadays anymore. Um, but I think the possibility is in the field, and I think these are kind of rooted ideas that we all have that we don't. I think everybody that comes to Europe from America will see this diversity of cultures, and they praise that. They love the architecture difference. They love the difference. You can drive in a car in 2 hours. You're in a totally different country, speaking a totally different language with totally different cultural background, and that's a beautiful thing.
Let me add a couple of things that we're talking about nation states, uh, or something, not states within a nation, I don't think. But in any case, as I thought about it, it seemed to me that what you have is that nations and government are synonymous. In fact, that it's hard to visualize, certainly in an area with the a time of complexity as we have now, to have any kind of a nation or any kind of a state, if you will, that is not a function of the complexity of the situation that we live in. And so when you think about that a little bit, you say that that from a domestic point of view, when you think about a government, that it's all based upon trust. Now, Greg touched on this, that you need a government because there is a lack of trust, essentially. And the government plays this intermediary role between conflicting ideas and conflicting interests within. If you didn't have that, then you'd be back. If you didn't have the complexity that we had, you might be back to the Iroquois nation or the others, where they got around in a circle and everybody kind of came to a common agreement. That's easy to do if you're not very complex and you don't have a whole lot of people, but it's different in this situation. And the reason why this is important and interesting, it seems to me, is because if you're moving into a new area, and a new area, there may well be, it's likely perhaps, maybe augmented by technology and other kind of things, that you would find yourself in a new kind of a situation where government was not the way we understood it to be. Cliff suggests that the whole thing kind of collapses very quickly at many different kind of levels. And that then, by the way, sets up the possibility, one of what could be many, of a big giant catalytic event that then provides the impetus to drive the system off in another direction. So it's not, there's no way in which you can look into this thing and say it's just extrapolatory. It's just a, you know, the end point of a present kind of trend. Nah, there's something that happens here, and there could be any number of these kind of secrets revealed that show up that could drive this thing in a whole different way and change the way all of what humans think about this thing. So to talk about benefits here a little bit, what governments do, or what is they spread the cost around for common things that are required. And so these governments that arise from the complexity and the need for common funding and generating common objectives are in the end very susceptible to where the money comes from. And in this particular case, you can think about big banks and oligarchs, and how that in the end, this is not about people. It's about how they get squeezed by the big forces. And clearly that would happen on very large scales with some of these people of great capability. I've always thought that the cool thing would be that and you could do this easily with on the internet now, and certainly with AI, is that every agency of government would have to justify itself to the people every year. And if they can't justify themselves, then their budget gets cut. Well, that would generate some input, some kind of feedback in there.
Well, I would, just jumping in on what you were saying about banking. I think that's kind of one of the critical issues here. Because essentially, when a country or a nation has control of its own printing of currency, it has way more power than if it's controlled by an international conglomerate of central bankers. Because, that's kind of the problem that I see still with everything right now. There's America, as far as I understand, still has the ability with its Congress to shut down the Federal Reserve, but are they doing it? Or, do they believe the propaganda of the Fed, which is a private corporation, that they don't, which actually they do. But when they do that, they will essentially eliminate a huge burden, because it's those international centralized banking interests which move into a country and offer, money for infrastructure, for anything that they need in exchange for the sovereignty of that nation, whether it be resources, or they give them war machinery, like we're seeing happening right now. I mean, this is these kinds of old world models are still alive today in Europe right now. I mean, the Europeans are talking about creating a European fighting force because they're still locked in that old mentality. And it's, that's the only way we're ever going to get beyond that is if we take away their ability to just grab our money, tax us for it, and print money at will. And so I think the first step, and one of the first and foremost step is, yeah, get control of your finances, get control of your own central bank, and rule. And with the aid of these tools that we've invented as humans, AI and things like that, yeah, it's great. We can actually have them calculate things for us, and it'll offer, it'll take away the burden of having to spend, a long time calculating things and reduce that and making it far more efficient. The other aspect is the idea of communication between people and this group. I call it like a Senate because of, getting people that are based on merit to make decisions is better than having people who know nothing about a particular topic, which you have now in these posts that are being flushed out by Doge in America as a bunch of incompetent people just sitting on a salary. The model of the future, this will no longer be viable. But at the same time, the people that are voting and that are making decisions saying yes or no, they themselves have to step up to the plate and take responsibility for and take an interest in the infrastructure of their nation, whatever size it may be. Because what is a democracy if 90% of the people are sleeping, uninterested, or half of them are doped up on pharmaceuticals? I mean, these people are not going to be able to give a decent, valuable feedback to the so-called representatives of the government, and they know that. So these are part of the things I think that we're going to have to flush out of the world that we have around us right now. And it has to do with this idea of the human sovereignty and the real powers of humanness, the organic humanness, versus this transhumanism, because transhumanism is what does Klaus Schwab say? You will own nothing and be happy, right? Well, who in their right mind would adopt that slogan unless you already kind of fogged in with some kind of a ignorance based on either, taking pharmaceutical drugs or just taking no interest whatsoever in what's going around in the world around you and looking at it and standing up and saying, you know what, I've got to do something. I can't let this, we've got to be so fed up with something that you're fed up with being fed up about it, that you get up and you actually, you take action like the way, like you are, like I loved how you were going around giving people ham radios and you were meeting with people in Berkeley Springs. And I mean, if just think if more communities were to do that and begin to network, then we could use all these tools that we've got, the internet and whatever, to trade information globally and make a very efficient system. But as long as we have these overshadowing dark aspects, which are centering around money and central banking, and power structures that are based on narcissism, psychopathy, and all this stuff. This is the stuff that we have to look at. This is the dark side of the human psyche. We need to face and flush out and put in the open, put a big spotlight at it. I think that's what I would say.
I think you nailed it, Frank. And we have these conversations, and I think we have to bear in mind that these things are not happening in a vacuum, that there is a process. We're in the process. It has a beginning, it has an end. There's a sequence, there's a hierarchy. And so we are now dealing with a population in the West anyway, that has been intentionally dumbed down through education systems, through the pharmaceutical industry. Uh, and part of that is psychological and emotional exhaustion from what we've all been through in these last few years. There was a very interesting, I think it was on one of the late night talk shows, where they just sent a guy down to Venice Beach, California, to interview random people. And the first question they asked was, who's the president of the United States? And maybe they just stacked the deck to make it look this way,
I've
because
seen
I
those.
yeah, I know some people know, but there were young people there. I mean, young people of voting age who had no idea who the president was. They thought it was Barack something, and they have no idea. I mean, they're so
Yeah.
disengaged and unplugged. So the process has been effective in that respect. But I think, John, the catalyst that could drive the kind of change you're talking about The two catalysts, and we've identified both of them, I think economic and the movement that what we're calling the transhuman movement, or the movement to bring us all into a digital landscape. Most people that I'm talking to, even the ones at our events, know that that's happening, but they're less concerned because at this moment it appears to them it's still out there. You know, it's about digitizing resources, tokenizing resources. Yeah, they don't like gene modified corn, but they can deal with it until they really are faced with having them accept something into their bodies. I think that they don't want. I think they will probably be less engaged with that at this point, right now, in this conversation today. I think the possibility of an economic reset is going to come quicker and is going to affect more people in a concrete, palpable way. That's what's going to get everyone's attention. So what Cliff High is saying, and I think most of our viewers already know this, the number of dollars, because we are in a what's called a fiat currency, there's nothing backing our currency right now since 1971 when we left the gold standard. So the number every dollar that is printed dilutes the value of the ones that exist. And we're already diluted by the Fed's own estimates. About 97% of the value has been lost, at least. So to identify even more dollars will drive that dilution down. That would collapse the dollar typically. I think the current administration knows everything we're talking about. That's why they're repatriating the gold into the US. And a lot of people don't realize this. The gold on our balance sheet, we've got about 800 tons of gold valued at $42 and some change, as it was post World War II, where the spot price right now is 3,000, and it's manipulated. It should be 5 to 10,000 an ounce, easy. So when the dollar, at the point where the dollar could collapse, I think that is where this administration, and I think this will happen quickly. I think that's where this administration comes in and says, we now have the gold to back our dollar, a new currency. We'll still call it the dollar for convenience. And this is where it gets concerning, is because I think they'll want to put this onto a blockchain. They will want to go the digital route. And you know, once again, technology isn't right, wrong, good, or bad. If that were done in a benevolent society with a benevolent government who was looking for our best interest and truly cared about us, it could be a good thing. We don't live in that world. And so moving into that kind of a monetary system does just the opposite. It opens us up for more vulnerability, more susceptibility to power, control, limitations, and that's the opposite of what we want. So it's really interesting. On the one hand, I think it's good that the gold is coming back in, and it could zero out. We have enough gold, it could literally zero out the debt of our nation on the balance sheets. And at the same time, and the other piece of this, Trump wants to roll back federal income taxes. We only started taxing our population's income after the World War II to pay the debt of the war. And always before that, they have used international taxes, tariffs, to fund the nation, plus a flat tax. I mean, you know, you go to the grocery store, there will be a tax, but it'll be a flat tax. Think of what would happen if we become a debt-free nation because of the gold on the balance books. And now every citizen no longer is paying anywhere between 20 and 35% of their income to tax. So now that becomes part of their disposable income. There's a huge economic shift, I think, that is on the horizon. What direction that takes, I think, is what's up for grabs right now. Can we direct that to a good, beautiful, and healthy thing? Or is it going to play right into the vision of this centralized controlled AI modulated world. And because of the people running it, it looks like that might be where it's going because of Elon's vision.
Well, there's an interesting, if you look at this kind of, again, back away and look at the big kind of sweeps of the end, how the big driving forces, as we call them in the futures business, how they run is that if you had a major catalytic event, we've mentioned one of them at least, and there are any of a number of them, particularly when you're talking about secrets being revealed that have been kept quiet in the past. When you have one of those kinds of things, what it does is it opens up an environment that is highly transformative. That is to say that all of the kind of the links and the relationships that provide stability and resiliency, if you will, of the system suddenly become malleable. And now the whole thing can rapidly change in another direction. And what it also does is generates a lot of chaos and uncertainty in the middle of the process and opens up the possibility of some kind of a benevolent dictator, let's call him, let's hope. Some kind of a strongman or a strong person kind of a small group that comes together. Now, that's interesting because we have a number of examples in history of where benevolent dictators have been marvelous people, and this you just mentioned, Greg. And it's far more the most efficient thing. I used to do a lot of work in the government of Singapore, and Lee Kuan Yew was essentially a benevolent dictator, and what the man said is what happened. But he clearly had the well-being of the country and the people in mind, and what it turned out to do is the Singapore miracle that exists right now. And so anyway, as this thing moves into this new direction, then what you have is all kinds of possibilities that present themselves, and driven by the necessity to not go backwards and do what you've done in the past that has precipitated all the uncertainty. And so there's a place in here where there's a whole lot of new ideas that could be generated. And again, I suggest that the use of AI in that process could be very, very interesting.
Yeah, I agree, John. I think one thing we have to be really cautious of is because the things we're talking about are counter to the vision that has been presented by the globalists in the past. And if things aren't moving in that direction, we need to be aware and vigilant of false flag kinds of events that will bring opinion together and drive us in the direction of those visions that have been stated by the UN, by who wants to be the president of the world. The UN wants that, and the WEF. If we're not moving in that direction, we have to be very aware, and I think probably around war type issues, who we're blaming for attacks, how we perceive those threats, whether it's coming from Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, or whether it's coming from, we haven't even talked about what's happening, the breakdown of Syria, which is now, for all intents and purposes, 5 different states within the country that used to be called Syria, and what's going to happen there and how that affects the U.S. So I think we just have to be very vigilant, and when we see something happen, to really look closely at what we're being presented, rather than just taking the mainstream narrative.
Oh, necessarily.
Yeah.
Well, all of this, implies there's an active participation by the citizenry that is enlightened, that has a certain level of consciousness, that's, awake and alive. And, because essentially, I think, we can, if we find a way to kind of honor ethnicity, like different, groups of people, different cultures, and we decide to work together globally, to raise humanity as a whole up, and we set mutual goals and we script some form of covenant, which is based on prosperity, and technical assistance, and an unconditional pact to make life better for all human beings, animals on the earth, then, this kind of an international covenant could replace what's out there right now in terms of globalism. I think it's a little bit naive to think that as consciousness develops, there's not going to be some form of global consciousness that's going to happen out there. I think, this is something that's been in the minds of a lot of people, future thinkers in the past. But based on the limitations of information flow back in the past when those ideas came out, like the noosphere and things like that, they're nice ideas, but they kind of already exist. We just have to kind of catch up to them now with our new modern society, which is evolving. And I'm hoping and I'm holding out for that 100th monkey effect, where enough of us are maintaining a presence out here and we keep driving these repetitive ideas out there, even if we've probably said them 1,000 times already, you need to hear these things again and again. If they stick, because no one's, if you don't write them down and put them in front of your face, you're going to forget. We forget those things. We get caught up in our habits and our day-to-day lives, and we lose out on the opportunity to better ourselves on an individual level, let alone on a level that's group oriented or culturally oriented. So the more of us that can keep talking about it and on a repeated basis, keep pushing the ideas out there and keep reminding people of what the models might be. I mean, we don't know what they're going to be ultimately, but I totally agree with you, John, that some kind of a benevolent dictatorship. It can be in the form of a group, it doesn't have to be
Yeah,
one
sure.
individual. It could be three people, like a CEO triad, working with a larger body of people like a Senate, which are developing these ideas in a transparent way with the rest of society, which has an open, view of the activities that are taking place and the things that are being decided upon. And I think if that happens, and if we can move into that model, we can make it. The only other option I think is to build the ark.
Well,
We build the ark, man. So
I
let's
agree. I agree, Frank. Maybe that'd be one person. Maybe it could be a quartet. Who knows?
yeah.
yeah. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't, segue onto that back here at the Arlington Institute, we're interested in this building this new world, or a new country, or a new state, or whatever you want to talk about, because it seems to me that you don't get there unless you kind of head that way, or if you set it up as a goal or a vision, as an objective of where you want to do. Otherwise, it's haphazard and disorganized and so on. And at least if there's a framework and an objective and some funding and some other kind of things, then you can always change the direction you're going and modify, what's being generated. But we need to get going on this very quickly, because as was mentioned earlier, there really is 2 years or less before this whole system, this digitized system through a digitized identification and digital identification, and through the central bank digital currencies, all kind of just lock it down, and then there are no options. And I'm seeing that show up many different places, seemingly independently from a lot of people who are all coming to that conclusion.
There's another factor which I wrote down in my notes, and I could show you here what it looks like. We did a film called Solar Revolution, and in that film we showed that solar cycles of sunspot activity have a direct relation. I'll show it again. A direct relation to the rise and fall of cultures on the planet, right? So we can add that factor in as well. That there's a greater, you were mentioning it earlier, John, this frequency that's been registered coming in from the cosmos, right? Well, what if there is something to it? And the thing is, we do have these other macrocosmic influences, because we aren't just these little people on a planet. We're now discovering in science that, with all these new discoveries, that there's a microcosm and that is reflected in the macrocosm on a fractal way. So maybe the whole system is working together to try and, make this evolutionary jump, to try and find this new form of society, the ideal society. I mean, people like 140 years ago, there was this woman called Madame Blavatsky who wrote something called The Secret Doctrine. And she was talking about this new root race, and it was, I think it was the sixth root race or something. And she'd broken down all the societies, and that we've had and gone through Atlantic and all that stuff, Atlantean, into a root race, and that we would sort of move into one that's spiritually united. Now, of course, she added in, parts of it that kind of overlap with something a guy called Richard Kalergi wrote, which is kind of nefarious, that everything's going to blend together and be this bronze race, of uniform, like no more diversity, any kind of, skin color, whatever. I think those kinds of views are a little bit scary to me, honestly. I like the diversity. I like that there's black people and red people and yellow people and white people. I mean, I think that's what makes life interesting. So maybe Blavatsky was onto something in terms of spiritual development and on a global level, but we can find a way that we can still celebrate the diversity, and we can lock into the fractal existence and nature of the plasma of the universe that we're part of, that's out there, that we're finding reflected in the neural network that's now visible with radio telescopy and with infrared telescopy. We see this neural net that's out there. So I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that we have to look forward to. And again, we just need to teach people about this stuff to make them see it. Because if you don't know it's out there, you can easily lose hope in this crazy world out there right now. It's very, very easy to lose all hope. And hope is one of those special endowments that we've been given as humanity to drive us, to motivate us to keep going, even in times that are really, really tough.
I,
So are we going to get on the predictions, John?
Yeah, well,
I thought we had a freeze on the system.
Yeah, we
so
all
that's
froze
why
on the screen.
Frank, right on everything you just said. Now, I think we do need to keep in mind that all of these things that we're seeing are potentials, they're possibilities. A lot of people don't like to know that, and especially when it comes to religion, they like to believe that we're locked into a sequence of events that must unfold. And I think what all of those, I keep coming back. I did a program the first time I met with John. I did a program at the DC Convention Center, and you never know who's going to show up there. And they had six guys in black suits came into the program in the back of the room, and they stood against the wall. They wouldn't sit down. And during the break, when everybody else left, they came up to the stage. And I asked him, I said, are you okay with what I'm doing? Do you have a problem with what I'm doing? Why are you here? He said, no, we don't have a problem. He said, we're interested in your perspective. And this is where it got interesting. He said, we thought, whoever we is, we thought we had a handle on everything that is going on. But his exact words, he said, it appears that something has gone horribly awry, was the word that he used. He says, what do you think that is? And I said, I would imagine that your models are not accounting for human consciousness. And he said, you're right. The models are all about things and stuff happening in the world, and they're trying to put a number on that. But human consciousness is very hard to quantify. And I think what you've just identified, Frank, is the key, that we can change all of that. And I know you and I have talked about timelines and human potentials, and there are windows of time when the deck is stacked in our favor to do that, and cosmological and solar cycles drive those windows. And I agree that we are in, the indigenous traditions have told us that we're in one of those windows right now. So I think that's an empowering message that we need to bear in mind. So thank you for
it's an empowering message. And what it also does is generate a sense of urgency, I think, because what happens is that those windows close. They inevitably close. And so you've got a limited amount of time in order to try to get going in a different direction, build a new framework, whatever the term you might call it. And we need to be about that, and we need to do that in a hurry. So thank you both for a very interesting conversation, and thank all of you who are our viewers. We appreciate having you here. It'd be kind of boring to do this and just talk to ourselves and not have any feedback. And so we very much appreciate that. Quartet comes to you from the Arlington Institute, which is a little think tank that we put together 35 years ago outside of Washington, D.C. And now we've moved it to Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, which is our little resort town, about 100 miles from Washington in the Appalachian Mountains. And we hold forth here in a variety of programs, all oriented toward facilitating the transition to a new world, because we think we're in the middle of this easy to characterize it as the biggest change in kind of recorded history, at least. And so we're into some very interesting times, very disruptive times with extraordinary kind of potentials and futures. And we think that merits some intelligent kind of consideration and conversation. And that's why we come here today. So come back and be with us. We show up like this every couple of weeks. And along with any of a number of other programs that we have at the Arlington Institute, and you can find them all at arlingtoninstitute.org. And we encourage you to come and be with us. And in particular, I want to highlight our Transition Talks program. Every month we bring a speaker to Berkeley Springs, and we live stream it around the world. Gregg Braden comes, and Gregg's with us so on an annual basis, and be here in May. Frank will be with us in September of this year, and we've got a whole lot of interesting people. Edward Grant here on the 22nd of March, and then followed by Dave Martin in April, and so on. So it's always fascinating and interesting, and it's unique. I think we're not aware of any other program like this that's certainly on the East Coast, if not the whole country. So come and join us, and thanks for being with us. And all of us, and you and your cat, Frank, can all make it back here to Quartet. And thank you so much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Frank. It's good to see you. Thank everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, brothers.